Welcome to Writers at Work. This month's installment is presided by one of the most special guests that we have invited. We have with us none other than Mr. Anil Menon, one of the most acclaimed writers of speculative fiction from India and around the world. So, before we begin, I'll give a brief introduction of yours and then we can begin our conversation.
Sure, Nilesh.
Anil Menon's most recent work is The Inconceivable Idea of the Sun, which is a collection of stories of speculative fiction. His novel, Half of What I Say, published by Bloomsbury in 2015, was shortlisted for the 2016 Hindu Literary Award. His debut novel, The Beast with 9 Billion Feet, was shortlisted for the 2009 Crossword Prize and the Carl Baxter Society's Parallax Award. Along with Vandana Singh, he co-edited Breaking the Bow, published by Zubaan Books in 2012, an international anthology of short fiction inspired by the Ramayana. His stories have been translated into more than a dozen languages, including Arabic, Hebrew, Igbo, and Romanian. He is the chief editor of the Bombay Literary Magazine and a co-founder of the annual Kolam Writers Workshop. His upcoming novel, The Coincidence Plot, which is going to be published by Simon and Schuster, is scheduled to appear in July this year. So it's an absolute honor to host you at the writing studio at
My
IIT
pleasure.
Gandhinagar.
My
Thank you so
pleasure.
much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure, David. I'm really glad when the moment I got the invitation, I said yes because the IITs are one of my favorite institutions to work with. So it was a no-brainer, actually. So I'm very pleased to be here.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So kind of you, sir. If we can begin with our conversation, I would like to know, since speculative fiction is a very special niche within the genre of literary fiction as well, and of all the speculative fiction authors whom I have read in terms of their interviews, there are some particular inflection points in their younger life from the things that they've read, from the things that they've engaged with. What have been some of the inspirations which drew you towards this genre? What did you grow up reading, and how did that affect you as an author of speculative fiction?
Yeah. So I think like a lot of other Indians in the growing up in the 80s and 90s, we were exposed to, we would read anything that we could lay our hands on, right? There wasn't any
That's good.
marketing divisions that we see today in bookstores. As long as it
Mm,
is English fiction, we would probably read it. So thrillers, science fictions, fantasy, and we would just read it as if without really knowing in which category these works
mm, mm,
fell under. It's just a
mm,
story, right?
mm,
And I remember that one of my friends, his name is Ashok Bhavnani, he was very good at crosswords. And I think there were midday crossword prizes in those days. And he won a
mm.
prize. I think it's like 50 rupees or 100 rupees.
Okay.
A really major award, the Booker of its time. And so we took this money and we went to Strand bookstore and we were trying to buy the fattest book we could
Okay.
because to get maximum for our buck.
Definitely,
And
definitely.
science fiction sells by the kilo; they don't sell by the. So there was
I
this.
believe those those book sales are still around, right? In
Yeah,
Mumbai, where yeah, you
yeah,
get
yeah.
science fiction by the kilo.
Yeah, I
Yes.
came across this story, and it was, I think, a Ray Bradbury story.
Okay.
I forget the name of the story now. And it's a fairly well known story in which one person goes back in time and he steps on a butterfly, and when
Hmm.
he comes
Hmm.
back, he finds that the entire world has changed. So
Hmm.
basically, it's the
Hmm.
butterfly effect.
Hmm.
And I not read anything of that kind, that the sheer scale of time that the author was willing to consider, which is thousands of years, millions of years,
Hmm.
actually
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
things like time travel. All these were completely new ideas for me at that time. And I knew that
Hmm.
I was reading a different kind of fiction. The rules were
Hmm.
different of that
Hmm.
fiction.
Hmm.
You could
Hmm.
do with
Hmm.
situations and settings and so on. But it's kind of inchoate.
Hmm.
You have the early the technical training, and that led me to science fiction in a natural way.
Hmm.
But again, it was a kind of a non like I would. It's not as if I would only read science fiction. I would read pretty much everything
Of
which I could
course.
get. It was just that
Okay.
I knew that there was a special place for this fiction. And so the earliest stories I wrote were in science fiction.
Hmm.
But as I began thinking about the genre, it became clear that science fiction by itself was only doing one kind of speculation. It was doing speculation in the technical domain, in the material domain. And there were other domains I could explore. So that led me to thinking about speculative fiction and the other areas in which this idea of speculation can be applied. And it's a little different from distinct from fiction itself. So So that just has been a long journey since.
Hmm.
But it's primarily this story, Ray Bradbury's stories, which got me started.
Okay. So that kind of brings me to my next question quite smoothly, and thank you for setting it up in that way. So, what is the difference between science fiction and speculative fiction? Something that has
Ah,
been debated over and over, in literary canon as well. What do we
ah.
understand when we use the term speculative fiction? What does it encompass?
So I have a characterization which is not by no means it is the standard one, but
Hmm, hmm,
something that I use in my own work. So I will quickly run through how I think of it.
hmm,
Basically, the idea is that when you read a story or
hmm,
when you write a story, there are three kinds of sentences that you encounter. The first kind of sentence is the one that the author writes, right?
hmm,
The actual written sentence.
hmm,
The second kind of sentence is the one that the author does not need to write. Uh, that's
hmm.
because the context of the world is shared between the reader and the writer, right? So, for example, if I say it's raining, the author doesn't have to add the word water. It was raining water. But the
Okay.
context is clear, it's obviously raining water, right? And so there are sentences that the author writes, there are sentences that don't need to be written. And
Hmm.
finally, there are sentences that the reader writes. Uh,
Oh,
and
interesting. Okay.
they close the story, right? So the writer may leave certain things unsaid, and the reader has to do the job of filling in the blanks, right?
Hmm,
They have to mentally fill in the blanks.
hmm,
It's not as if they actually physically, right? It's that they mentally
hmm,
fill in the blanks, right?
hmm,
So you say,
hmm,
so this is what must have happened. This is what the emotion meant. This is why
hmm.
the person did X, right? So there are these three sentences, and the first and the third, the sentences that the writer writes and the sentences that the reader writes, they are common across literature. Every genre of
Hmm,
literature
hmm,
has these kind of sentences. Sometimes you can really disagree on what a story means, and the readers are disagreeing on how they're writing the story. But it is a second
definitely.
sentence that is interesting, the sentence that don't need
Hmm,
to be written because the context of the world is understood. In speculative
hmm.
fiction, right, this context is not taken for granted. So you find
Okay.
that it is raining, right? It is not necessary in a speculative fiction story that it is raining water. If you were on Jupiter, the enormous pressures on Jupiter would turn carbon into diamonds. And when it rains on Jupiter, it would be raining diamonds, right? So
Hmm,
when you read the sentence, it was raining, and then you read the next word, diamonds, then the reader suddenly understands that you're not on planet Earth anymore. You're in another
hmm,
world. The context has
hmm,
changed. The
hmm,
rules have changed, right?
hmm,
And then you got to figure out what kind of world this is, what kind of
hmm,
context you need to work with. And the
hmm,
lot of the pleasure in speculative fiction is that figuring out the context of the story, what the
hmm,
rules are for this world.
hmm.
And it need not be just the material and technological context, which is what science fiction deals with, the
Of course.
technological changes, the physical
Hmm,
changes, a
hmm,
different planet or a different time.
hmm.
It does not necessarily be that. In speculative fiction, you can go with, for example, the legal context. Suppose you have a
Oh,
world in
interesting.
the rules are different, right? Or suppose you have, say, psychological context when people do not think the way you think. Aliens, for
Hmm,
example, is a good example where the psychological context can differ. But even on planet Earth, right? Our assumption that everybody thinks the same way is simply not true. Different cultures have very
hmm,
different ways of
hmm,
reacting to different situations. So by exploring different kinds of contexts, you get different kinds of speculative fiction. You can get economic speculative fiction. You can get anthropological speculative fiction. You can get psychological speculative fiction, and it's very far and very removed from science fiction in the traditional sense. For example, in surreal fiction, right?
hmm,
Ordinary objects become fantastic. They become marvelous, magical, right? So
hmm,
surreal fiction changes the meaning of the word ordinary. And
hmm,
you're never really sure whether a cup is a cup. It could be something else by the time the story is done with
hmm,
it.
hmm,
You
hmm,
find that different genres like magic realism, in which
hmm.
magic has a special place, but it's treated in an ordinary way, right?
Ordinary
So
manner, of
yeah,
course.
so the way the different genres interact with the idea of the context is what makes each kind of special in its own way. Science fiction, of course, deals with the technological and material context. So it's a subgenre in speculative fiction. But typically,
Hmm.
speculative fiction would include things like magic realism,
Hmm.
surrealism, realism,
Hmm.
all the varied forms in which you don't take actuality as actuality. The context
Hmm.
do
Hmm.
change throughout the story. Yeah.
So this reminds me of some of the books that I have read over the course of my, my academic journey as a literature major. I remember hearing the term feminist speculative fiction from one of my professors, with context to Ruqayya Sakhawat Hossain's book Sultana's Dream,
Yes.
about her, imagining a whole world into existence, and how that comes into being. And so, are you there? Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? There seems to have some technical glitch. We'll just wait for him to rejoin. Yeah. We'll just wait for Anil to rejoin. I believe that he has some yeah, he's here.
Yeah.
Hello, sir, can you hear me?
There was a power cut. So
Oh, I see, I see, I see. Okay. Okay. Sir, if you could turn on your camera,
yeah, one second.
yeah, there.
For some reason, it's not letting me turn the camera on. One second.
Oh, okay.
Can I just log in again?
No problem, sir. No problem. Take your time. No worries.
Yeah, one second.
Thank you. Yeah, no problem.
Still no camera, right?
Yeah, no camera, sir. I can hear you fine and clear, but I
Yeah,
do
this
not
is
see your
actually
image.
using my camera from the phone, and instead
Okay.
of the camera, just check.
It's all right.
Technology,
We
as we
can,
know.
yeah. No problem, sir. No problem, no problem. Please take your time. It's okay.
some reason it's not letting me change the video setting. Yeah, I'm not able to change the video setting, Naveen.
Yeah, that's fine. So I think we can go ahead with just this then. No problem.
All right.
Yeah, okay. So I was just mentioning that, the definition of speculative fiction that you have established, it reminded me of some books that I had read when I was a literature student, including, Sultana's Dream or Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude and Rushdie's Midnight's Children. All of these, they fall under the genre of magical realism, like you mentioned,
Mm.
which was something with which I was fascinated by. And there's just the scope of imagination that it builds up in your mind. It makes you feel powerful as a reader, since you can give additional meaning to the text which lies in front of you. But these are fairly complicated ideas. How do you, as a writer, and speaking purely from the point of view of craft, how do
Yes.
you make them palatable for your readers through your language, through your narrative, through your writing? If you could just give us a glimpse into your writing process and the choices that you make as a writer to communicate and convey these ideas to your readers, and how has it changed across your scope of career, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. So I think every writer at sooner or later learns to uh, forget the reader at some point, right? At
Okay.
least in the first couple of drafts, you have to let the story speak for itself and not let
Hmm,
the reader interfere, not let anyone
hmm,
interfere, actually. In fact, you don't even let yourself interfere to some extent. You keep
hmm,
your critical editing voice out of the picture, right? You just write. In fact, that's when you find that your unconscious or whatever it is that is motivating you to write the story, uh, sometimes it's just your hands on the keyboard. Now you find that you are led to places you did not anticipate, right?
hmm,
So once you have that story, it'll be very incomplete. There'll be too much stuff, there'll be too little stuff, there'll be stuff that is unnecessary, and so on. That's when the editor comes in, and that's when you allow the reader to have their say to some extent, but this is too complicated, or this is too tedious, or no one's interested in the life cycle of frogs or whatever. You let that voice play out in your head, right? And that this
hmm,
can take a lot of time. It can take up to a year. Someone like Nair Masood would take up to a year to finish his short story, right? So the editing process is very slow, it's very painful, and it's also a lot of fun because you're trying to, so the tough part is over. The initial the, the the initial corpus is the, you're making sure that you're saying it in the best possible way, right? In my case, I always write to a reader who I think is a lot like me, in the sense that is interested is for them whom the sentence is important. It's not
hmm,
just about getting to the destination. They take pleasure in a well-written scene, right?
hmm,
And they're looking for something a little. Maybe they have to do some bit of work in terms of understanding what's going on, even if it is just an emotional scene. It is precisely because an emotional scene that you expect of the reader that they'll pay some attention as to
hmm,
what the author is trying to say or what the story is trying to say. So you look for you have certain standards of the reader, so you don't worry too much about whether they will get it or dumbing it down and so on. Right? But that will just take
hmm,
you into a area where you're just speculating on the reader's preferences, and typically
hmm,
that no one really knows what readers want. So you're just guessing, right? And that's not a good idea. So you write the story that needs to be written, and especially the story that only you can write. For me,
Hmm.
that's a important criterion. If I get the feeling that someone else could have written the story, then typically I don't find it that interesting anymore to write. You're looking for a story that only you can write, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
When you get the feeling that this is you have written that story, it's strangely speaking, it stops mattering. What the world thinks of it. And it's not arrogance, it is just that you're content, right?
Hmm.
So, for example, there's one story I wrote, I think it was called How Not to Tell the Ramayana. And it was an extremely difficult story. And it took me, I think, at least a year and a half to get it to a shape where I was not embarrassed to show it to people. It's reads very in a very academic way. And it's
Hmm.
like, is it a story to some extent, right? But I remember being very happy after I finished writing it and after it was done. It strangely did not matter how its reception would be in the world. And then you know you've done something right, that you have
Hmm.
done something that's, it works for you. And that's
Hmm.
quite. Uh, I hope that explains it a little, lends some clarity to the situation.
Definitely. And that, then thank you for mentioning the Ramayana, because I was eager to ask you this one question. Across the speculative fiction that I've read, including,
Ah,
dating all the way back to Jorge Luis Borges's short
yes,
stories,
yes,
or across, some of what Tolkien has written in his
yes,
fantasy is also very speculative fantasy, if you think about it.
yes, yes,
But they derive a lot of inferences, a lot of influence from mythology. And
yes,
that parallel is quite interesting to see. What do
yes.
you, as a speculative fiction author, see particularly in mythology that led you to edit Breaking the Bow, for example, or working so much in the domains of Ramayana? What kind of stories come out when you tinker with mythology, if I may say so, through the lens of speculative fiction? What have been some of your experiences?
Yeah, in fact, there is the person, one of the people who triggered the original Ramayana volume is here. Pervin is here, I think, Pervin Saket.
Oh, okay,
And
okay, okay.
she
Welcome.
had written a story in which she had conceived, I think, Sita as
Hmm,
an alien figure who has come to study human, something like the ethical systems, right? And this is an ethical
hmm,
problem. What you do with a wife who you suspect of infidelity or suspect of not being pure enough. And then she was studying this moment in human history. And the alien notices how people react and so on. They're gathering data. And I remember thinking that what a strange take on the this particular scene in the Ramayana. It's a very science fiction take. And Pervin does not write science fiction, thankfully.
hmm,
And but this story was remarkable. And I remember going to Urvashi and saying, what if we had people kind of reconceive situations, and they're inspired by the Ramayana. They're not necessarily reinterpreting and so on. They're inspired by it, particular scenes, right? And we would have an interesting anthology. So that's how that one got started. It turns out it's quite difficult to do.
hmm,
Mythology, we have come to a point where we don't really think of that word, right? In the sense, but a myth is actually very, very peculiar. It's not.
hmm,
It's a story, of course, but it's a very strange kind of story. And myths are
hmm,
absolutely bonkers. Most myths, if you read them, right, they make no sense whatsoever. The characters do crazy things. The characters are in search of crazy things. They get crazy kinds of help. The logic is all warped, and then there's no. And the realism is at best it's a very tenuous hold on the story, and it's psychologically they are bizarre, right? And
hmm,
I think, but what has happened is we sanitize them over the years by retelling and telling and retelling. We make them rational. So we take someone like Lord Rama, who fought a bitter war and who obviously loves his wife, and is faced with this ending in which he has to decide, and he decides that this is a decision he wants to take,
hmm,
and no one's satisfied with it. So we kind of retell that story, we reinterpret it, we give justifications, we criticize. So you have all kinds of tellings. There's the feminist Ramayans and so on. And that's what people do it with every myth. So Tolkien, for example, took the Norse myth and he was influenced and
yes.
he cast them into this world in which he's corrected many of the things that he found were not quite reasonable in the original
Hmm,
Norse myths.
mm,
So you find this tendency to rationalize a myth immediately the moment it's written. And I
mm,
think it's very hard to invent a myth from scratch. If you tell six
mhm,
people and say write a myth, you'll find they're usually quite logical, right? The kind of craziness we require, it comes from a very deep place, and it's not something that is easy to do. Especially in fantasy, you can see people invent all kinds of myths and fantasies, and they just don't have the kind of deep psychological power that the old myths do.
mm,
So the myths are fascinating for me in that sense. Our Indian myths are particularly fascinating in the sense that, in the case of, for example, something like the Mahabharata, you find
mm,
that every character is treated with respect, right? Respect
mm,
in the sense that their point of view, they get a point in the story where their point of view is heard.
mm,
Now, you may disagree with it, you may call it immoral, you may not think that they're good people, but the author does not make that mistake. The author gives them their due, right? He's a just God. He's created the characters, they behave in certain ways, so they get their point of view across, and it's up to the reader to decide. So I had an uncle who was a lawyer, and he was convinced that the Kauravas were right, and he told
interesting.
me,
Okay.
let's hold a case, let's hold a court case, and we will go through the argument as if I'm a lawyer for the Kauravas, right? And I will prove that what they did was right. Now that's how he reacted to the story as a lawyer, the
Mm,
legalities of the case, right? But a different person would read the story very differently, and that the Mahabharata makes it possible for you to have that where
hello?
Duryodhan can hello.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, I can
So
hear you. I can hear you now. Yes.
Duryodhan can die, and his last sentence to is there a man luckier than I? Right?
Mm,
And you're like, how can this man who is broken, his thighs are smashed, his kingdom is gone, his women are going to be taken, his children are dead, yet he sees his life as a success, and the book is able to conceive that, right? And I
mm,
find Mahabharata. What I took from the Mahabharata was when you write a story, don't take sides and make some characters hollow, right? Treat all
mm,
your characters as if they have justifiable points of view in their scheme of things, right?
mm.
uh, then they become kind of real, because it's only a question of whether you disagree or agree with them, but the fact that they believe that they are doing the right thing is important. It's not a war between good and evil, it's usually a war between two sides who think they're both on the right.
On the right side, of course. Yes. So, in with respect to that, how important does characterization become in speculative fiction, especially when you are dealing with mythology? Like you said, Parvinji wrote about Sitama from the perspective of her being possibly an alien, and investigating the human society of that time for ethical implications. So, how important are characterization and plotting both in order to make a story consistently entertaining, at the same time impactful? Because the way that we understand narrative structures is that plot is what makes it gripping, while characters
Yeah,
are what make them valuable, in
yeah.
terms of they are the carriers of value, they are the carriers of morale and messages for people. Like each character signifies a certain value which is endorsed through their actions. How important do characterization and plotting become in your experience throughout your writing?
They both become important in the context of one of those missing variables, which I think many like when you go to workshops, they tend not
Hmm.
to talk about it because it's very difficult to talk about it. The situation. So the situation
Okay.
typically is neglected, right? So you
Hmm.
find that you establish someone as a hero or someone as a coward, and that's the kind of picture you give them. And no matter how you establish, suppose it's established, and then you put them in a situations where they don't behave that way, right? Then you
Hmm.
suddenly they become interesting because you do not understand. You have certain expectations of this person, but you find that the situation has made them react differently, and you want
Hmm.
to understand why is it that what is it about this situation that changed them, or why are they
Hmm.
behaving in this way. So the
Hmm.
situational theory of why we do what we do is also reflects what we know about human psychology today, right?
Hmm.
Many of the, for example, people who were in the Nazi camps,
Hmm.
the the guards and so on, when they, after the war they escaped, they settled down and they had perfectly ethical lives, that they were
Hmm.
decent, they paid their taxes, they were good, they had pets, right? And they were kind to their neighbors and so on. But in the camps, they were absolute monsters. So you ask yourself, I think the Leon Norris novel Trinity was, I think,
Hmm.
called Trinity, was about a doctor who was an absolute monster in the camp, but in outside life, he's a humanitarian.
Okay.
And it's only when he became famous enough that they noticed him, that who is this guy? And they began remembering that this is the same guy who used to, do things to babies and so on. So
Mm.
the situation was it is not the person as much as the situation, right? And I think I like fiction which explores situations. Literary fiction, the great merit of literary fiction is that they take a very serious interest in situation. And
Mm.
a lot of genre fiction tends to focus on plot and character, and ideally, there's no reason why it should be restricted to genre. You could have a great genre novel that takes situation very seriously, and you get
Hmm.
these psychologically deep novels, right? I think, for
Mm.
example, Edie James, when she writes her novels,
Mm.
you find that the situation is as important as actually solving the murder mystery or whatever. So for me,
Definitely.
the great interest in fiction is trying to come up with a bunch of situations that reveal people uh, for in ways
Hmm.
that are unexpected, right?
Mm. I think that can also be related back to your fascination with mythology and how that
Yes,
is inspired, because even in that case, like you mentioned in the Mahabharata, right, there is no war between good and evil. It is about two sides which both believe that they are on the right side,
yes,
and
absolutely.
their perception is shaped by the situations that they go through.
Yes,
A lot of,
when
yeah,
yeah, when Kunti comes to Karna and says, "Spare my, spare your brothers," for a moment we are not really sure what Karna will do,
of course,
and
of
because
course.
you know that he gives gifts. At the same time, he's a very loyal friend, so
Mm.
you do not really know how he's going to react. And that's precisely the beauty of the situation, because you find that this person can lean this way or that way, depending on how he reads the situation. Go ahead, Naveen.
Definitely. Yeah, there is one dialogue that Karna says in one of the rewritten versions of the Mahabharata, which really stuck with me. When Kuntima goes to Karna and asks him to spare the lives of all the Pandavas, because of his personal rivalry with Arjun, Karna says, "Mata, I promise you, at the end of this war, 5 of your children will be alive."
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, it's fascinating, what
yeah.
good writing does to good characters, character development in that sense. So let me bring you to your role outside of your fiction writing.
Okay.
If I can talk about your project with the Writers Workshop that you run, the Kolam Writers
Yes.
Workshop,
Yes.
what kind of trends do you see emerging from the writers that you have trained over there and the writers that you interact with on a regular basis? Where do you see the streams of Indian writing going, and what can we anticipate in future? I ask this for a slightly selfish reason. A lot of people on the IITGN campus aspire to be writers across different genres, right? Both of fiction and of nonfiction. So your insights from the writers workshop will be very helpful in inspiring them or encouraging them to follow the pursuit that they are on.
Yeah, it's a really tricky question, Navid, because the
Okay.
question is what are we teaching, right? What are we teaching? If
Mm.
you're teaching anything at all, it's not like, say, a calculus class where there is a definite technique. Now, there are certain things that are a matter of technique in writing, and they can
Mm.
be learned relatively
Mm.
easily, though they are
Mm.
difficult to put in practice, perhaps. And that's regarding how you use grammar, how you focus on dialogue, and things like that. So
Mm.
there are some basic the mechanics of the situation that can
Mm.
be taught.
Mm.
But in reality, I think what really a good workshop will do is to work on the writer. And you find that it'll take a while, maybe 5 years, 6 years, whatever time it takes for the writer to find their voice. And that is it's just a time intensive process. But there is a psychological aspect to the whole writing, the way you approach a story, right? And so I can think of a good example is Feynman. He was asked, why is it that mathematicians, who obviously know much more math than physicists, they rarely did great physics, right?
Mm.
He had plenty of mathematicians who knew more physics than Feynman. But why is it that
Okay.
Feynman was necessary? And Feynman joked that to do physics, you gotta have style.
Mm.
There is a there is a way of approaching a problem, right? And
True.
mathematician approaches problem in a very different way from a physicist. So the necessity of certain things, the rigor, amount of rigor, all that can be played with, and the focus on the problem. What is important in a problem? So that there's a certain style you bring to like in a physics problem, but there's also a
Hmm.
style you bring to a story. So when
Hmm.
Salman Rushdie approaches a fairy tale, he's going to come with a certain style. When Jane Austen comes to a story, the things that
Hmm.
she notices of that, that's interesting, that's relevant, right?
Hmm.
So when you come to a workshop and you see writers discussing stories, or you read a lot of stories, you see your facilitators talk about stories. What you're really kind of gathering from the environment is kind of invisible. Is a way of approaching story. Uh,
Hmm.
you're not going to be approaching it like an amateur henceforth, right? You're
Hmm.
going to be
Hmm.
thinking about the story in ways that a reader will not do. In other words, what you're going to do, the most important thing is you're going to stop being just a reader. Uh, the
Hmm.
thing with us is that we are such good readers that the text becomes invisible, that we stop seeing the
Hmm.
text. And
Hmm.
a large part of the workshop is to wake you up. So you start noticing the text, you start noticing the dialogue, you start noticing the way the story begins, the way you approach the story suddenly is changed. And for a lot of people, it might come as a loss. You generally feel certain sadness when you realize that you can't approach stories with the same innocence that you had
Hmm.
for the workshop. That innocence is somehow lost, right? Because you know, you can hear the gears, you can see the gears,
Hmm.
you look for the gears, you look for what makes it work. The very idea that you ask, why did the story work? That itself indicates that you have changed in your approach to the story. And once you learn to ask these questions, you will develop your own answers. And those answers
Hmm.
will not be the answers of, say, Rushdie or Ray Austen or Julian Barnes or whoever. It'll be your answers, and that will constitute your style. So they will say, for
Hmm.
example, oh, with this guy, he always goes after the weather. Or with her, my God, there'll be like reams of dialogue on so and so, right? It's just their style. That's how they see the world.
Hmm.
The question
Hmm.
that interests them about a situation is what they figure out, right? And enabling students to come to that point where they can just generate their own questions. You find then you're succeeded, because then you know that they'll find the answers. Whereas if you're spoon feeding them, you're saying, well, this is how we do dialogue, and never begin with the weather and stuff like that, not giving any chance to for them to learn to ask what questions to ask. What questions should I ask about the story, right? So one of the things we do a lot of in the workshop is just get the discussion going. Uh,
Hmm.
for example, in the workshop, we don't call it critique; we call it charcha,
Okay.
because the idea is to just sit and talk about the story in a kind of a non-threatening way, right?
Hmm. I love the user's non-threatening way when it comes to critiquing someone's story,
Yes.
because yeah,
Yeah,
while providing feedback, that is always one of the contentious things, right? How do you not make the other person your enemy at the
yeah,
end of
yeah,
the process?
yeah,
But
exactly. And
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
in a conversation is easier, and you
Hmm.
find that you're trying to understand, right? And my starting point is the belief that if you ask people why they wrote this story, you will
Hmm.
actually hear a very beautiful reason.
Of course.
Almost everybody has a great reason, great insight, or whatever it is, to explain why they wanted to write this story, right?
Hmm.
And what happens is that intention cannot be carried out for various reasons. It
Hmm.
somehow may not carry through fully. It may fail in various aspects, but the intention is there, and then you can focus on how to get that intention translated onto the page, and that's generally useful when you start focusing on, so what were you intending. And
Hmm.
then the person has to speak. And in many
Hmm.
critiques, the author is not allowed to speak, right? They are told, you keep quiet,
Hmm.
you give a critique, you take it
Hmm.
silently, take it like a no, well, basically take it like a man, right? Don't cry and stuff
Hmm.
like that.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then you go to your room and you fix a story. And this kind of hazing is supposed to be helpful for your development as a writer. But in actual fact, it helps to know what the author was intending, and whether they succeeded, what the other participants think, how much of the intention
Hmm.
came through. It's kind of useful. So a kind of a cordial discussion. It's
Hmm.
possible. It's not always easy, of course, but it leads to a better understanding of what needs to be done for a story.
Hmm. Hmm. I hope that this is something that we all can acquire when we provide feedback, because feedback needs to be something which is humane. Only then can it be constructive, uh, because that is something that we propose to our students as well when they are peer reviewing each other's writing.
Yeah.
uh, always respond to the idea and not to the person, because then it
Yes.
becomes it becomes a little, like you said, it becomes volatile, right? It becomes
Yes.
something
Become
which is,
volatile. Yes.
yeah,
Yes, in fact,
that's
it's
the
tricky.
mm,
Yeah, actually, I think today, these days, we might find that there is a sense in which it's very difficult to separate the author from the story. Right? People seem to have difficulty
definitely, yeah,
separating,
definitely.
making this distinction, and so
Mm,
something that annoys you in the story is kind of ascribed to the author itself. Um,
mm. That's true, and I believe that it requires a certain sense of clarity to make that distinction on the reader's part or on the critic's part as well.
uh,
Yeah, but thank you for laying it down so beautifully, because even in our writing classes or at IITGN, one of the things that we primarily work on is the perception of writing as offloading of cognition.
uh,
So if one is to make beautiful writing happen, one needs to go back to their cognition first. Most writing happens up here, and then it is laid down on paper, right? So one needs to get clarity in thought. Clarity in thought is reflected in clarity in writing. So that is something which we try to work on as well. And I'm pretty sure that people who are engaged with writing classes, both at the instructors and the learners end, will benefit a lot from this insight, particularly. So, Anilji, before we throw it open to the
yes.
audience for questions, would you like to talk about the novel that we can anticipate from you very soon?
Oh, the coincidence plot.
Yes,
Uh,
yes, please.
yeah. So I had fun writing this novel. It turned out to be very different from what I had originally anticipated. In fact, it reminds me
Mhm.
of something one of my mentors, Jeff Ryman, told me a long time back, and I'd asked him why was it that there are no, or rather there aren't that many novel writing workshops. You have short fiction workshops, but
Exactly.
novel
Yeah,
writing is not
definitely.
rare. And I asked him, why is that? And there are the obvious reasons, time and so on and so forth. And he said that, well, that's because, Anil, when you're writing a novel, halfway through you realize you should be writing another novel, right?
Hmm.
So, yeah, fundamentally, a novel is a work that keeps reconstructing itself. And what you start off and what you end up with are very different. And this
Hmm.
novel, Coincidence Plot, it's a case in point for me, where I'd begun thinking that this person
Yeah.
in Germany and following their
Hmm.
lives and so on. But ultimately, it ended up in a very different place, and it's based on this question, a single question, which is, um, is everything that exists in the universe, does everything that happen in the universe happen for a reason? Uh, that is there any such thing as a coincidence at all, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So you get to, is there anything such as randomness, for example? Is everything that happens, is there
Hmm.
a reason for why it happens?
Hmm.
And obviously, you take people have strong views on either way, and I know I have a certain my own position on this particular thing. But I was taking Spinoza's position, which is that
Yes.
everything that
Yes.
happens in the universe does happen for a reason, cause
Hmm.
or reason, and it's called the principle of sufficient reason. And he wrote his
Hmm.
ethics is kind of built around this idea.
Hmm.
So I have in the story of one of the characters is a Spinoza, let's say Spinoza devotee, and he
Hmm.
takes this to heart. He lives his life. He's a writer, and he that's how he sees the world.
Hmm.
And one day he meets a woman who believes the exact opposite, that there are completely random things. There are things that happen for no reason at all, right? For example, genocide, or
Hmm.
accidents, that you find that if somebody who is head of a family, you find is killed in an accident, and the family is
Hmm.
left to the mercy of the winds.
Hmm.
There are things that happen for no reason at all. So these two people who disagree fundamentally in how they look at the world, they meet, they clash, and that thing has consequences throughout the book.
Hmm. Hmm.
Disagreement, and it's a study of that disagreement and what it leads to. So the old Victorian novels, if you remember, they were strongly based on coincidences.
That's true.
Things
Yeah.
like Charlotte Bronte's novels and
Hmm.
other
Hmm.
novels, Thackeray's novels. Coincidence was how you showed that God was behind everything, right? There
Hmm.
is the hand
Hmm.
of God. And so coincidence was very important in the Victorian novel. And in this
Hmm.
novel, it's kind of a throwback, and it looks at the idea of today. Coincidence is not in fashion. It's not something
Hmm.
that you put in your stories. It appears as artificial. It appears as forced. So in this novel, it kind of places the idea of coincidence.
So, Anilji, before we throw it open to the audience, do we have free will?
Spinoza would say, no, you don't, but it does not
we don't.
matter.
We don't, but
It
it
does
does
not
not matter. Yeah.
matter.
I, I want that on a t-shirt as soon as possible. We don't have free will, but it does not matter. Thank you so much, Anilji. That was an absolute delight talking to you. That was an
Thank you, Nivek.
absolute delight.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. Yeah.
definitely
Anybody from
interesting.
the audience, if you have any questions, please, you can unmute yourself and you can ask Anilji. We have about 5 or 10 more minutes of Anilji's time. He's been very gracious and kind to give us his time this evening. So if you would please like to go ahead and ask him some questions if you have.
Yeah. I'm sorry about the video, guys. For some
That's
reason,
that's
yeah.
that's okay. That's okay. No problem. If you'd like to ask Anilji some questions, you can please unmute yourself and ask him your question. Or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you from my control. All right. Assuming that nobody has questions, Anilji, thank you so much. It was an absolute
Oh,
honor
yeah.
interacting with you, and thank you for being so gracious and kind with your time tonight with us.
My pleasure, Navid. Thank you very much for
Thank
inviting
you.
me. It was an absolute blast. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Anilji. Have a wonderful day ahead. Thank you. Bye bye.
Yeah.
Take care, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.